In the realm of biblical scholarship, where every word is scrutinized for historical accuracy, one often overlooked aspect stands out: the significance of names. While our previous explorations have delved into the role of names as indicators of reliability in the Gospels and Acts, a recent article by Camille Greger and Brian Blaise in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus challenges this notion. They contend that the limited sample of name occurrences within these texts may lack determinative significance, further compounded by several statistical irregularities that cast doubt on a favorable assessment. This will be an in-depth examination in response to their paper by myself and New Testament scholar Luuk van der Weghe and statistician Jason Wilson, working off their paper, Why Name Popularity is a Good Test of Historicity. If you have not watched the videos where I cover this argument, let's rewind a bit to where it all began. The argument stems from the groundbreaking work of Tal Ilan and her 2001 Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity. Think of it like a massive phone book, but instead of numbers, it's filled with the names of around 2,500 individuals from the time of Jesus. This treasure trove provides us with invaluable insights into the origins and popularity of names among Palestinian Jews of that era. It's thanks to Ilan's dedication and subsequent volumes that we have this wealth of data at our fingertips. This is where New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham comes in, who wasted no time in leveraging Ilan's database for his own groundbreaking research. He noticed some fascinating patterns: how names were preserved or sometimes forgotten throughout the editing process of the Synoptic Gospels, the variations in name forms across different lists, and how certain names clustered around specific points of view. Bauckham's analysis, using Ilan's lexicon, also uncovered a striking correlation between the popularity of names in the Gospels and Acts and the population demographics documented by Ilan. This figure visually represents Bauckham's findings. While it's not a perfect match, the alignment between the two datasets is pretty remarkable and laid the foundation for Bauckham's argument for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts. This is where Camille Greger and Brian Blaise come in. They summarize their findings by stating that Bauckham's thesis offers no advantage in explaining the observed correspondence between name popularity in the Gospels and Acts and in contemporary Palestinian Jewish population over an alternative model of anonymous community transmission. They contend that there are many issues with this argument, and while we will be going over the issues with the response to Bauckham, they also advance this conversation in a few ways.
Yeah, there are several ways that Greger and Blaise's paper advances the conversation. They did some admirable work in scraping the data from the online database, for example. They also brought a statistical element to the conversation that both Bauckham and myself didn't provide in our work. Bauckham and I are not statisticians, and so Camille did a great job in getting a statistician on board, taking in the data, taking it the best way possible, presenting it in a very transparent way so that Jason and I could access it, and furthering the discussion. So even though Jason and I disagree with a lot of their methodology and as well as their conclusions, I think both of us are glad that they put this paper together. And it's always been a desire of mine since I started this project on names about 4 or 5 years ago to put together a case that's statistically rigorous and objective. And I think Camille and Blaise, they advanced that conversation in the right direction.
But Greger and Blaise make some critical mistakes in their paper as well. As Luuk and Jason state in their paper, while advancing the conversation, critical missteps undermine Greger and Blaise's assessment of names in the Gospels and Acts. For their analysis, they reduced the list of name occurrences in Gospels and Acts to contested names, in other words, to only names of persons not corroborated by other primary sources, and then conclude that the sample is too small to draw statistically significant conclusions. Due to their isolated focus on contested names and their improper testing methodology, Weghe and Blaise fall short of providing a suitably robust statistical analysis that their piece claims. We will now go through these issues piece by piece and how they demonstrate that. To begin, in their analysis, Luuk and Jason incorporate 7 sets of data, 2 reference distributions and 5 test distributions. The reference distributions represent real populations that the test distributions are compared against. Specifically, they analyze name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts, and Josephus against name occurrences from 2 populations in Ilan's database to determine how well the test distributions fit into a reference distribution.
There are test distributions and reference distributions. What the reference distribution is the historical benchmark. It's the ground truth. It's the thing that we want to check and see if the test is matching up against. And so, for example, if you roll a die, we expect the outcomes of the die to be 1/6 on each one. However, if you're rolling a die and you wind up getting 6s half of the time, you might question, well, when I tested it out, it didn't match the reference of 1/6. In the same way, we have ground truth reference distributions, and then we have some test distributions that we want to check and see if they match. The principal test distribution is the Gospels and Acts, but we have a few others. We have Josephus, ancient Jewish historian, and a few others.
Luuk and Jason chose to use the Ilan reference distribution compiled by Heyman Lapin from Tal Ilan's database. Despite independently scraping similar data, they opted for the dataset from Weghe and Blaise from Ilan Volume 1, which closely aligned with their findings and included additional data from Josephus. To clarify any misunderstandings up front, Luuk and Jason say, as a brief point of clarification, a name occurrence is the number of times a name is attached to a unique person. For example, Simon has 8 occurrences in the Gospels and Acts because it is attached to 8 persons. But Peter also has 1 occurrence, even though that name is attached to someone already named Simon. This must be distinguished from the number of times a person's name is mentioned in a text, which is irrelevant to our exercise. A title like Simon Peter would give 2 occurrences even though it only refers to 1 person, and regardless of how many times this person might be referenced in our source material. Finally, we only consider males in our analysis for the mere reason that antiquity's androcentric focus limits the available data for female name occurrences. A second set of data covers names of Western diaspora Jewish male names from Tal Ilan Volume 3 within the same time frame. This highlights differences in name distributions between diaspora and Palestinian Jews, supporting the hypothesis that diaspora Jews encountered a markedly different set of names, predominantly Greek, reflecting their integrated cultural environment. Among the top names in the diaspora, only Simon overlaps with the Palestinian list, illustrating distinct naming conventions that emerged due to differing social influences. Next, in section 1.2 in their paper, Luuk and Jason explore 5 test distributions to analyze name occurrences in historical and fictional texts concerning Palestinian Jewish male names. These test distributions are compared against the reference distributions to assess their historical accuracy. For some of these tests, especially the first one from the Gospels and Acts, Luuk and Jason disagreed with Balcom and Weghe and Blaise on whether or not to include certain names. For this reason, Luuk and Jason ran all of their tests with both Balcom's data as well as Weghe and Blaise's reduced list of only contested names. This ensured the robustness of their findings. Significantly, the Gospels and Acts would have passed their statistical test regardless of whether they used their own dataset, Richard Balcom's dataset, or even Weghe and Blaise's dataset of only contested names. The first test distribution examines the names in the Gospels and Acts. They adopt Balcom's dataset with 3 key modifications. They include the 6 Hellenists from Acts 6:5, Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, and Parmenas, exclude Rufus and Alexander from Mark 15:21, considering them non-Palestinian due to their father's origin, and remove Bartimaeus from the Gospels and Acts due to inconsistencies associated with leaving it in. This results in a total of 82 name occurrences for the Gospels and Acts.
When it came to Bockham's dataset, we only made changes to it when we thought that it was worthwhile to make the change. And so the 6 deacons, because it seemed that everyone agreed that they're likely Palestinian, everyone else being Gregor and Blaise and Tal Ilan, we decided to go with the majority opinion, also because it made sense to us. The setting indicates that these 6 deacons, although they all have Greek names, were likely Jews from Palestine. So we made that small change. We took out Rufus and Alexander because they're likely from Cyrene, which is in Libya. And then we also took out Bartimaeus because Bockham counts Bartimaeus really twice, once as Timaeus and then once as Bartimaeus. Simply because the form Bartimaeus, Bockham thought it was like a separate nickname. The problem with that is that it's inconsistent. So Bartholomew is another name in the Gospels, for example, and it comes from Ptolemy, and that's how Bockham and Tal Ilan categorized that name. Well, why isn't Bartholomew then 2 names if Bartimaeus is 2 names? We didn't think it was consistent. It wasn't consistent with Ilan's practice. So for Bartimaeus, for example, we only designated that occurrence with the name Timaeus. And all that we wanted to do is be consistent with the criteria that we'd established. Are they Palestinian? Are they Jewish? Is this a personal name? Then we include it.
The second test distribution involves the names found in the works of Josephus. They use a sample previously scraped by Gregor and Blaise and augment it by adding the name Quaphia to better reflect historical context. The third distribution focuses on Ilan 1F, a collection of names considered fictitious by Tal Ilan, originating from non-canonical Christian literature and rabbinic texts only loosely tied to authentic traditions. This data helps us assess how names fabricated by ancient writers might still fit within authentic naming practices, providing insight into efforts to maintain authenticity in literary creations. The fourth test distribution examines name occurrences in the historical novels Ben-Hur by Lewis Wallace and The Spear by Louis de Wool. These novels are scrutinized to determine how well-researched historical novels perform in achieving onomastic verisimilitude. Notably, over 35% of their name occurrences are influenced by Josephus and the Gospels and Acts, highlighting the author's deep engagement with historical sources.
We included a sample from modern historical novels. So we picked Ben-Hur because it's very well known, and we also picked The Spear, which is less well known, but it has a lot of both fictional and historical names from the Gospels and Acts and Josephus. And so what this last sample provides for us is provides us like a best case scenario of what a fictional author could achieve if they had access to Josephus, if they had access to the Gospels, and if they tried to mimic the naming practices of Palestine during the time of Jesus. Looking at the historical novels, it really helps you appreciate how challenging it is for a fictional author to create an authentic representation of name distributions in Jesus's Palestine. Because with both Ben-Hur and The Spear, you have these authors who are doing a lot of research. They're going to the Library of Congress. They're looking through Josephus. The author of The Spear, he goes out of his way to try to assign biblical names to all the Jewish characters that he creates. So Ben-Hur, 60% of the names in Ben-Hur are actually taken directly from the Gospels and Acts or Josephus, simply copied out. So you have these scenarios with these authors where they're relying tremendously on works that we know have a lot of historical names in them. And nevertheless, they're still not able to get naming distributions that accurately reflect Jesus's Palestine. So what these works demonstrate to us, they demonstrate how difficult it is to actually create an authentic naming pattern like we have in the Gospels and Acts.
Finally, The fifth test distribution involves a hypothetical uniform sample of 52 name occurrences taken from the 457 names cataloged in Ilan 1. This analysis tests a scenario proposed by Weghe and Blaise, arguing that a random selection of names from this distribution could not be reliably distinguished from those found in contested passages of the Gospels and Acts. Through these comprehensive tests, Luuk and Jason aim to deepen our understanding of how names were used in various Jewish texts and contexts from the first century, providing valuable insights into the historical and cultural fabric of the time. Then Luuk and Jason follow this up by tackling a common issue in data analysis identified by researchers, Weghe and Blaise, who refer to low-frequency name occurrences in their Gospels and Acts test distribution as white noise. Luuk and Jason address this by implementing a method known as data binning, which is widely used for simplifying datasets, reducing noise, and improving analysis and modeling. This technique categorizes intricate data into discrete bins, allowing for a more structured and comprehensible analysis of even low-frequency occurrences.
So the reason we chose data binning for handling low-frequency name occurrences in our data sets is simply because that's just the standard way you do it. There's nothing special. There's nothing novel or innovative. That's standard method. As far as the advantages of it, well, it simply allows the conditions for the test to be satisfied because you're grouping. If you have too sparse, you can imagine just by random chance, you're going to get off of that one single name, no matter how large of a sample size you have. That's just the way that randomness works. So binning is standard.
To illustrate the effectiveness of data binning, Luuk and Jason refer to the initial data presented in Figure 1 of their paper. This figure highlights both the most and least common name occurrences but omits details on the common 42% of the names in the Gospels and Acts distribution. Without binning, this would be analogous to surveying voting preferences of the young and old only about voting trends, omitting the middle-aged, a method that offers deeper insights into the specific groups but fails to accurately reflect the entire population. Luuk and Jason say, quote, "Consider, for example, the data observed in the beginning of this paper in Figure 1. While Figure 1 gives great details of the most popular and the rarest name occurrences, it provides zero detail about more than half of the names in Gospels and Acts. Had we not binned the rare names for this graph, it would represent less than half of the names in the Gospels and Acts." Especially with smaller sample sizes, some mismatches are inevitable. Weghe and Blaise claim that, even if there were only one Simon in Gospels and Acts, this would not fit the distribution of name popularity in the contemporary population statistically significantly worse than what we actually observe in the Gospels and Acts. But Luuk and Jason argue that this claim overlooks the cumulative significance of each low-frequency occurrence within their binning model, which captures more nuanced aspects of population distribution than just the extremes of popularity. In their pre-processing work, Luuk and Jason focus on objectivity, consistency, and robustness. They ensure objectivity by aligning bins with reference distributions rather than test distributions. This means that the bins are defined by the reference data, ensuring consistent analysis across different tests. They employ equal frequency binning, distributing name frequencies into sets that match in size across the reference distributions, resulting in 6 bins due to the smallest bin size encompassing about 1/6 of all occurrences. These 6 bins will become clear later on in this video. Moreover, Luuk and Jason enhance their analysis by incorporating name origin statistics alongside frequency statistics, analyzing names categorized by Tal Ilan into 8 origin categories: Biblical, Greek, Latin, Persian, Egyptian, Arabian, Semitic Hebrew, and Semitic Greek. This dual approach of frequency and origin analysis provides a richer, more detailed exploration of naming trends and their implications on historical and cultural contexts. Moving on to section 2, we will go over some of the methodological points of the paper. In their paper, Luuk and Jason propose a compelling research hypothesis. The name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts are at least as historical as those from Josephus. So far, we have explored the literary and historical data supporting this hypothesis. Next, we delve into the statistical evidence. To rigorously test their hypothesis, Luuk and Jason employ the statistical goodness of fit test. This powerful tool helps determine how well the observed name occurrences in the test distributions align with those in the reference distributions. They meticulously define the statistical goodness of fit test, explain its application, and formally conduct 18 goodness of fit tests. These tests compare the test distributions against the reference distributions to evaluate their fit. And through this comprehensive statistical analysis, Luuk and Jason aim to provide robust evidence supporting their hypothesis, deepening our understanding of the historical reliability in the names of the Gospels and Acts. In section 2.1, to assess the historical authenticity of name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts, Luuk and Jason used the chi-squared goodness of fit test, a common statistical method to compare a categorical test distribution against a reference distribution. This method helps determine how well the observed data matches the expected distribution.
You want to know in layman's term how the chi-squared test works and why it's a reliable method for determining goodness of fit in statistical analysis.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's suppose that I had a coin, or as may be the case, a little piece of candy that if I were to flip this thing, then our theory would be that it's unbiased, and 50% of the time it's going to land with the heads up, right? Well, that's the reference distribution, okay, 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that we're going to find out if this thing actually is 50-50 or not, though, is by actually doing the flips. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I do 10 flips of the candy, how many do you expect to get heads up?
5.
Exactly. We'd expect 5. Okay. So if I do it and you get 5, hey, it matches the reference distribution. Okay. What if I told you I flipped it 10 out of 10, it came up heads? Would you think that it's really a 50-50?
Yeah, my initial reaction is that seems like extremely unlikely.
Yeah. How about 9? Would you buy 9?
I'd be more willing to take that at face value than 10.
Okay. I want to push you. What about 8? What about 7? What about 6?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the same thing.
Yeah. Where do you draw the line? Okay. The answer is the chi-squared distribution, the chi-squared test of goodness of fit tells us where to draw the line. Okay. And that's the role that the statistics play. Is we have the reference distribution, we can actually calculate what's the probability of getting all these different cases, and then we can make a decision there. Otherwise, it's just kind of a guesswork.
Yeah.
So that's why we're using this particular test.
For example, consider a scenario where we want to determine if a die is fair. A fair die would have an equal probability of landing on any of its 6 faces. Suppose we roll the die 60 times and obtain the following results: 5 rolls of 1, 8 rolls of 2, 9 rolls of 3, 8 rolls of 4, 10 rolls of 5, and 20 rolls of 6. In this case, the reference distribution reflects a probability of 1/6 for each face, meaning we would expect 10 rolls of each number if the die was fair. The observed values deviate from these expected values, especially for the number 6, which was rolled 20 times instead of the expected 10. To determine if these deviations are statistically significant, we calculate something called the p-value. The p-value represents the probability that the observed differences would occur by chance if the die was truly fair. In this example, the p-value is 0.0199, meaning there is about a 2% chance that we would see these differences if the die were fair. If the p-value falls below a pre-selected benchmark, often 0.05 or 5%, we conclude that the sample distribution does not match the reference distribution, and the test is considered statistically significant. In this example, the p-value of 0.02 is less than 0.05, so we conclude that the die is not fair. However, statistical tests alone do not provide definitive proof. They offer probabilistic answers. The power of a test measures its ability to detect a true difference between the test and reference distributions. For instance, if a die is slightly biased, the power might be low, meaning there's a smaller chance of correctly detecting the bias. Conversely, a heavily biased die will have a higher power, indicating a higher probability of detecting bias. In their analysis, Luuk and Jason performed 18 goodness of fit tests, comparing the test distributions against the reference distributions. They also accounted for the multiple testing problem, which arises when multiple statistical tests are conducted. To adjust for this, they used the Bonferroni correction, dividing the benchmark by the number of tests to ensure the reliability of their conclusions. Through this rigorous statistical approach, Luuk and Jason aimed to provide robust evidence supporting their hypothesis that the name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts are at least as historical as those from Josephus, contributing valuable insights into the historical authenticity of these texts. Moving on to section 2.2, recall that we have 5 test distributions of popularity and frequency data for our analysis: the Gospels and Acts, the writings of Josephus, historical novels, the fictitious occurrences from Ilan 1F, and Weghe and Blaise's uniform distribution. Luuk and Jason chose 2 different reference distributions, Ilan Volume 1 for Palestinian Jews and Ilan Volume 3 for Diaspora Jews. The research hypothesis assumes that Ilan was correct in classifying the name occurrences from the Gospels and Acts and Josephus manuscripts as valid entries. Therefore, occurrences in the Gospels and Acts and Josephus should fit Ilan 1, but not Ilan 3. Additionally, the 3 hypothetical samples, historical novels and Ilan 1F, and the uniform distribution would likely not fit into any historical reference distributions. This setup resulted in predictions concerning 18 chi-square goodness of fit tests. Table 2 outlines these tests and the hypotheses. For name frequency, it was predicted that the Gospels and Acts and Josephus will fit the Ilan 1 distribution but not the Ilan 3 distribution. Historical novels, Ilan 1F, and the uniform distribution are predicted to not fit either reference distribution. For name origin, we expected that the Gospels and Acts and Josephus to fit the Ilan 1 distribution, but not the Ilan 3 distribution. Since name origin data is not available for historical novels, this variable is not applicable for that category. Through these tests, Luuk and Jason aimed to validate their hypothesis by demonstrating that the name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts align more closely with historical Palestinian Jewish names as cataloged in Ilan 1 than with those of the Diaspora Jews in Ilan 3. This detailed statistical approach is designed to provide robust evidence for the historical reliability of the names recorded in the Gospels and Acts.
So looking at our table here, you can see that we performed 18 tests based upon how we wanted to test our 5 test distributions against our 2 reference distributions. And if you look across the top, you'll see there are our 5 test distributions, Gospels and Acts, Josephus, novels, Ilan 1F, and uniform. And then we tested those against the 2 reference distributions, which is the column all the way on the left. So we tested these against Ilan 1, Palestinian male Jews, and then also Ilan 3. And then within that, we wanted to look at name frequency statistics and name origin statistics. The reason we have 18 rather than 20 is because we didn't have the name origin statistics for many of the names in the historical novels because they were frankly made up. And so we didn't want to guess what those might be. So that left us with 18 tests. And our hypothesis is really quite simple. We predicted that Ilan was generally correct in categorizing the Gospels and Acts occurrences and the Josephus occurrences as historical. And because they were historical, they would then fit into the Ilan 1 reference distribution of Palestinian male Jews, but not into Ilan 3, into the diaspora. And then when it comes to everything else, it would not fit either Ilan 1 or Ilan 3. So the gray bars there, the 4 gray bars that say fit, that's our prediction for what we thought would happen going into our analysis.
Moving on to section 3, now that we have the specific predictions, we go to the results of the tests. In their analysis, Luuk and Jason conducted, again, 18 chi-squared goodness of fit tests to compare name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts and Josephus with 2 reference distributions, Ilan Volume 1 for Palestinian Jews and Ilan Volume 3 for diaspora Jews. The results are summarized in Table 3. For these tests, the names from the Gospels and Acts and Josephus were removed from Ilan 1 to maintain the independence of the distributions, which is a requirement for the chi-squared goodness of fit tests. Table 3 reveals that 16 out of the 18 tests matched the initial hypotheses. Notably, the p-value for name frequencies in the Gospels and Acts versus Ilan 1 is 0.8556, indicating a strong fit. Conversely, the name origin frequencies for Josephus versus Ilan 1 had a p-value of 1.09 times 10 to the negative 12th power, falling below the Boniferoni adjusted benchmark, which was unexpected. The power for all these tests was 0.999 or higher, so power values are not further shown.
So looking at our table here, there are 2 places in particular where our calculations were different than what we had expected. And first is the p-value for Josephus's name origin statistics. It's very, very low. That's interesting. And the reason for it is because Josephus focuses a lot on the elite of Jewish society. And among the elite, you have a lot of individuals that bear Greek names. So because of Josephus's focus, and also simply the fact that Josephus is writing in a Greco-Roman literary genre, means he's going to Hellenize Jewish names, just generally speaking. So that's the reason that Josephus fails, and it's quite interesting. You can see that the Gospels and Acts actually have quite a low p-value as well, although they pass the threshold for our tests. And that has to do with some similar reasons. So the Gospels and Acts also sometimes will Hellenize a name. So one instance would be Peter. Oftentimes they call Simon Peter, but John 1:42 also indicates that this Peter was known as Cephas. So we followed Bauckham in categorizing that name as a Greek name. Peter is a Greek name. If we would have used Cephas instead, it would of course brought that p-value up a little bit, but that would have benefited where we thought the data would go. So we chose to follow Bauckham's instead. And then also we included those 6 deacons from Acts 6. There's a very specific historical context that explains why there's a list of 6 Greek men there. These are Hellenistic Jews. They're meant to represent Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem. And so if you remove those 6 deacons, for example, then the Acts name origin statistics actually have a p-value that's even over the standard threshold. It's over 0.05. And then the last thing that was a bit surprising is the name origin statistics passing for the uniform distribution on Ilan 3. And the reason for that is that Ilan 3, that reference distribution is much more evenly spaced. So I've talked in the past about how there's a tremendously large number, a significant number of males who have these biblical names, the Hasmonean names. Well, that's not the case in the diaspora. So the name origin distribution is a lot more even. So in this case, because of that, the uniform distribution happened to fit that relatively well. but it did not fit with Ilan 1.
To visualize these results, figures 2, 3, and 4 plot the reference distribution as a gray bar and the test distribution of the Gospels and Acts, Josephus and historical novels, Ilan 1F, and the uniform distribution as grayscale 95% confidence intervals over the bar.
Figure 2. This is probably the most important figure in our paper, and I think it gives the best picture of what's going on. So we've got the 5 test distributions that are in the colors there. You can see them labeled in the legend. And on the x-axis, we've got the 6 bins. And so the first bin says 1, and that means in the Tal Ilan, this is the Palestinian male Jews around the time of Jesus. This is going to be the instance of single frequency names. That's the rare bin. Okay, 2-5, that's the kind of pretty rare. That's where the names are only occurring 2 to 5 times. 6 to 21, that's the frequency, all the way up through 151 plus. So in the baby name book of the day, those are the popular names in that farthest right bin. Okay. Now there's bars. Okay, what each of those bars represents, it's called a confidence interval. And so if you just use the percentage from the data in the test distribution, that would be the center of that bar. But in the same way that when we do modern political polling and we say, hey, 55% of likely voters are going to vote for candidate A with margin of error plus or minus 4% or whatever it is from that poll. Because we know that they only took a sample of the voters, and if you were to resample, then it would get a different number. And so that margin of error gives us that range of confidence that we have that we're actually estimating that true unknown proportion. So in the confidence interval, then that would be the center of it is the actual data estimate, and then the plus or minus is going to be the margin of error. So for example, the Gospels and Acts is the blue bar. It's the second one in the list. And you'll notice that it is overlapping the top of the gray shaded bar. What that means is for the rare names, the confidence interval covers Tal Ilan for the Gospels. You'll notice that Josephus, which is the fourth one over in the light green, that one also covers it. So Josephus and the Gospels and Acts are matching the rare name proportions. By contrast, the fictitious, the historical novels, and the uniform are all way above that bar. And that means that they didn't match. Okay, so as you start to move to the right, when you go over to the 2 through 5, we see fictitious, Gospels and Acts, Josephus, kind of barely, but it does cover it. Those 3 are matching the second bin of 2 to 5 frequency. By contrast, historical novels is actually too low. It's coming too short on those semi-rare names. And then the uniform distribution is a little bit high. As you move to the third and following, you can interpret in the same exact way. So what's important here is to note that Gospels and Acts, that blue bar, it actually covers it all the way across. Josephus looks like Josephus hits it all the way across as well. Do note that a few of them are kind of edgy, but it does get it. The other 3, sometimes they do, but for the most part they do not. What that is a picture of is a picture of either the fit for Gospels and Acts as well as Josephus, or a non-fit for the fictitious historical novels, and the uniform. We'll use the same interpretive method for the other figures. So moving on to the figure 3, the axis says name origin category of Ilan 1. Okay, so this is the same group that we're in, namely the Palestinian Jewish males of Jesus's day. And as we look at the fit here, we've dropped the historical novels because we didn't have the scholarly reference on the name origin. So we just have the 4 test distributions. The biblical names, all of them are too low. Gospels and Acts is closest to covering the biblical names. When we move to Semitic Hebrew, we've got Gospels and Acts contains the Semitic Hebrew portion. None of the other 3 do. And you can similarly move through on to the right. The one thing I'd like to point out here is each bar breaks out that specific category and looks at just that one category. What the test does is it takes the joint distribution into account, because if you have high on one category, that pushes you low on another category, and they're all in balance with one another. These are great pictures, but they don't tell us what the probability of those outcomes are. Let's jump back to figure 1. And the reason I want to jump back to figure 1 is to look at the right-hand graph. In this, we have the Ilan 3 database. That is male Jews of Jesus's day, but in the diaspora. So different geographic region. Now, we expect Gospels and Acts to be different here. And when we take a look, just focused on the blue bar, it's high on the rare names. And also, before I go into that, look at the x-axis again. First bar is rare names. Second bar is the 2 only names. That's because there are actually a lot fewer different names. There's only like 450 some unique names in that database, even though there's still multiples. And so the high frequency then is the 22 plus. With that said, you can scan through and see Gospels and Acts is a very poor fit. And Josephus also is a pretty poor fit there. That takes us then to figure 4, where we have the same reference distribution now, the Ilan 3 diaspora Jews. And again, we see that looking at that blue bar for the Gospels and Acts, it's a poor fit for the diaspora origin.
Moving on to section 3.2, and turning again to figure 2, the occurrences from the historical novels and Ilan 1F compared to Ilan 1 generally do not fit, especially in the overrepresentation of infrequent names. This data contradicts the argument from Weghe and Blaise and aligns with the observations that name rarity is typically overrepresented by inventors of names. Although Ben-Hur and the spear were combined into a single sample for analysis, their p-values fall significantly below the threshold when considered separately. Ben-Hur has a p-value of 9.071 times 10 to the negative 6, and the spear has a p-value of 2.831 times 10 to the negative 15th. The uniform distribution versus Ilan 1 shows an overrepresentation in the 1 frequency category and severe underrepresentation in 71 through 150 and 151 plus. This result is expected since each name was represented only once. As Table 3 demonstrates, testing the Gospels and Acts and these hypothetical samples against Ilan 1 shows that for a male Jewish Palestinian population from 4 BC to 73 CE, the number of name occurrences in the Gospels and Acts fits the reference distribution while the other test distributions do not. Next, Consider the 26 uncontested Gospels and Acts name occurrences as cataloged by Gregor and Blaise. When tested against Ilan 1, they have a p-value of 0.1369, which is well above the 0.0028 benchmark. Adding the contested name results in an even better fit, suggesting the authenticity of the contested name occurrences. Even if, contrary to the evidence, a fictionalizing author achieved accurate and intricate naming patterns, several factors suggest the name statistics in the Gospels and Acts are not the result of a fictionalizing process. For instance, 2nd to 3rd century Gospels often overshadow Jesus' Palestinian environment with mythological concerns. Moreover, Gospels like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas add unusual names or popular Western diaspora names, showing disinterest in realistic onomastic verisimilitude. The lack of qualifiers to distinguish persons with popular names in such compositions contrasts with the Gospels and Acts approach.
Yeah, so the lack of historical care in the apocryphal materials, it manifests itself in various ways. Oftentimes, you'll see that the disambiguators, which we'll talk more about soon, are often removed from names. So, for example, rather than having James, son of Zebedee is that disambiguator or qualifier. In the apocryphal material, oftentimes they would simply remove those types of qualifiers. Sometimes makes it quite confusing to know, for example, like which Mary they're talking about, because none of them are disambiguated. And that's one feature where you can see they're losing some of that historical touch there. Another is simply in the relatively few amount of names they have. So you look at apocryphal gospels like the Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Peter, they just have very few names, oftentimes under 10 in total. And then lastly, you see an increasing amount of mythology coming into play, where sometimes you'll have, in fact, many more mythological names than you would authentic Palestinian Jewish names. And so it's when you compare the naming practices of the Gospels and Acts with the apocryphal material, I mean, it's like day and night. It's very distinct.
Assuming a later author meticulously examined sources like Josephus to reproduce accurate name statistics is implausible. Such a hypersensitive focus on names contradicts available evidence and aligns only with Richard Bauckham's recent research. Furthermore, the historical setting in the Gospels and Acts naming frequencies presents challenges for a fictional author. High occurrences of several Hasmonean names make achieving apparent authenticity difficult. This explains why the name origin frequencies of anonymous community transmission versus Ilan 3 fit with p-values above the benchmark while not fitting Ilan 1. The high occurrence of persons bearing fewer names in Ilan 1 creates patterns of historicity in the Gospels and Acts that are difficult to quantify. For example, 64% of the disambiguated names in the Gospels and Acts belong to the top 5 names, reflecting a realistic scenario of distinguishing individuals with common names.
So when you look at the Gospels and Acts and the way they disambiguate names, you'll see that a very high percentage of the names that they disambiguate, so in other words, names that they add qualifiers to, like Simon, son of John, you'll see that a very high percentage of the names that they disambiguate are then among the most common names. And this is what one would expect if you were looking at a text that's reflecting the historical situation. You know, imagine you're in a crowd. There's going to be many people there named Simon, many people there named Jesus or Joseph. So you're going to want to distinguish one Jesus or Simon from another. And so the natural pattern would be to have the most common names most frequently disambiguated. And that's what you see in the Gospels and Acts. That is then distinct from what you see in a novel like The Spear, where about half of the names that are disambiguated are not popular at all. So the author of The Spear went through and tried to make it look authentic by adding these similar type of qualifiers to the names that this author created, but there's no correlation between name popularity and the number of names that are disambiguated, whereas there is a positive correlation when you look at the Gospels and Acts. name statistics.
The Gospels and Acts naming practices favoring natural name retention support the hypothesis of an authentic historical record rather than an invention. The evidence does not support Gregor and Blaise's contention that the Gospels and Acts name popularity distribution could result from anonymous community transmission. Instead, it aligns with ancient historiographic practices involving primary source materials, data compilation, participant inquiry, and eyewitness recollection. In conclusion, the evidence supports the research hypothesis, demonstrating the historical reliability of the names in the Gospels and Acts, challenging the alternative model proposed by Gregor and Blaise. In Section 4, having completed their analysis of the data, Luuk and Jason now explicitly address the work of Gregor and Blaise and highlight why their findings differ from them, identifying the shortcomings of Gregor and Blaise's statistical analysis. The primary argument of Gregor and Blaise rests on their figures 1 and 2, which shows 95% confidence intervals of name frequencies similar to Luuk and Jason's figures 2, 3, and 4.
So I think it's important to comment on Gregor and Blaise's figures 1 and 2. And so if you take a look at the figure 1, figure 2 is very similar. It's just Josephus. So I'll focus in on the 1, but the comments apply. So if you take a look at that, you'll notice that their gray bars on the bottom are their reference distribution, which they're fixing as the uniform. And then they have their confidence intervals, which are represented by the lines, just like we do. And the diamonds are the actual frequencies. In our figure 2, there's actually the same underlying data, and there's a lot of parallels between these two. So the contrast would be, we're showing the true number of occurrences as the centers of our confidence intervals, and we're doing binning so that assumptions of a goodness of fit test would be met, whereas Gregor and Blaise are just breaking every single name out individually, which really increases the amount of variability that you have to face. Okay, so in their diagram then, if you look at the black diamonds, you see this trend where you have these high frequency names are rising above their uniform distribution, and then it goes like this. When I see that, I see a trend of high frequency names are up, and then when you get down to your low frequency names, that's low. That is the shape we have in the historical reference distribution, like we show in our figure 1. Now, Gregor and Blaise draw the opposite conclusion from their diagram, and they do it because their confidence intervals are really, really wide. The reason they're really wide is they're just using that single name proportion. And so when you limit yourself to just the one single name, you have a low sample size, which really inflates your amount of variation. So that's what's happening. By contrast, in ours, we bend, we're shrinking the interval sizes down, and you can see we're matching where we're supposed to match, and it's not matching for the other distributions besides Josephus.
According to Luuk and Jason, Gregor and Blaise's second major issue is their implicit assertion of statistical hypothesis tests with a null hypothesis of anonymous community transmission or random name selection. Gregor and Blaise reversed the null and alternative hypotheses, which is contrary to standard statistical practice.
Now, another contrast between our figure 1 and then Gregor and Blaise's figure 1 and 2 is the reference distribution. So in ours, our reference is the actual Ilan database, whereas in theirs, the reference is the null distribution. If you go back to the proper way to set up a goodness of fit test, the null hypothesis is the test against the reference distribution. They've chosen their reference distribution to be uniform in this case. So the problem with that is, if you were to come up with a rejection of that hypothesis, what would your conclusion be? Well, their conclusion would be, oh, if it doesn't fit the uniform, then it fits the true reality. Why? There's so many other possibilities beside a uniform. Numerous possible fictional distributions would all count. It doesn't make sense. The only way it makes sense is that the reference distribution is the actual historical distribution, because as soon as you go apart from that, there's an unlimited number of possibilities. That's why the chi-square goodness of fit test is structured the way it is. Gregor and Blaise deviated from that. Not only did they deviate from it, but in section 5 of their paper, they actually switched back and they did use the reference distribution, what comes from the historical reference, as their null hypothesis. And that's an inconsistency in their paper. And that's one of the things that troubled us when we were reading that.
Third, Luuk and Jason argue that using Gregor and Blaise's method, a sample size of 53 or 52 from many other text distributions would also fit the uniform distribution.
Now, another issue to address is the issue of the sample size. In Gregor and Blaise's paper, they were saying that in figure 1, the Gospels and Acts don't, they fit the uniform distribution, whereas in Josephus, it doesn't fit because those confidence intervals shrunk on the overall trend of high frequency names rising above the uniform, whereas in the Gospel, the same trend was there, but the confidence intervals were too wide, they said. From a statistical perspective, that width of the confidence interval, and does it reach some other small uniform bar or not, that's an artifact of the sample size. If Josephus were to have written, let's say, less works, or maybe we didn't find those Josephus works, Josephus's bars would have gotten bigger, and then they would have overlapped the uniform distribution. And Gregor and Blaise's critique of the Gospels and Acts questioning historicity would also apply to Josephus. Same methodology could be used to any ancient writer that didn't have a large enough body of writings to have enough names. The problem with that is it's just not a good practice. It's not a good criterion to use to judge by, because it leads to these illogical results. And you don't need to if you use the proper chi-squared goodness of fit test.
Gregor and Blaise also used confidence intervals that assume independence between names, which Luuk and Jason argue is false. While these intervals are easy to calculate and explain, they ignore the multiple testing problem. The chi-squared goodness of fit test accounts for the dependence relationship between names. Gregor and Blaise also assert that names occurring only once in the Gospels and Acts provide no information about whether the Gospels and Acts fits the historical distribution. However, Luuk and Jason argue that the grouping individuals to meet the test conditions is a common issue in goodness of fit testing, and information for every name can be accounted for by binning them into appropriate groups. In Gregor and Blaise's section 5, they address the issue of rare names, but Luuk and Jason identify substantial problems with their methodology. Gregor and Blaise reverse the null and alternative hypotheses from section 4, showing inconsistency. Moreover, their conclusion is highly sensitive to the number of rare names in the list. Weghe and Blaise's list gives a 1.1% probability of 4 or fewer rare names occurring, which would jump to 7.3% if just 2 names were not excluded. Adding the Palestinian Acts Hellenists would bring the list to 8 or 10 rare names, increasing the probability to 24 or 50%. Luuk and Jason conclude that the Gospels and Acts name statistics do not result from the achievement of well-informed inventors or anonymous community transmission. Instead, they align with the current understandings of ancient historiographic practices involving primary source materials, data compilation, participant inquiry, and eyewitness recollection. In conclusion, Luuk and Jason's evidence supports their research hypothesis, challenging Weghe and Blaise's contention that Baucham's thesis offers no advantage in explaining the observed correspondence between name popularity in the Gospels and Acts and in the contemporary Palestinian Jewish population over an alternative model of anonymous community transmission. Weghe and Blaise's analysis suffers from a lack of proper statistical methodology, introducing critical errors into their conclusions. Luuk and Jason have sought to correct these missteps by employing the best available statistical methods and analyzing as much data as possible. Throughout their paper, Luuk and Jason have demonstrated how chi-squared goodness of fit testing establishes the naming patterns in the Gospels and Acts and fit well within their historical context. They show that these patterns fit statistically significantly better than those found in fictitious works from antiquity and well-researched historical novels from the modern era. By considering the Gospels and Acts name sample in light of 2 reference distributions, Ilan Volume 1 for Palestinian Jews and Ilan Volume 3 for diaspora Jews, Luuk and Jason provide a comprehensive analysis that includes name origin data, sample size considerations, and less quantifiable observations about name disambiguation and naming practices within invented materials. The evidence presented suggests that the Gospels and Acts accurately retained personal names, those unmemorable pieces of personal information, at a remarkably high level. This retention reflects characteristics more in line with Josephus than with ahistorical and novelistic samples. In the words of Richard Bauckham, all the evidence indicates the general authenticity of the personal names in the Gospels. Luuk and Jason's thorough analysis supports this conclusion, challenging Weghe and Blaise's assertions and reinforcing the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts. This contributes valuable insights into the ongoing scholarly discussion regarding the historicity of these texts.